Alright students, welcome back to Medieval 1450. I hope you are all doing well. So today we are going to look at some Gothic art and architecture. Before we begin on that, let's go back to that architecture day way back when. We talked about the early churches built soon after Christianity became accepted by the Roman Empire. These churches were generally based off Roman basilicae, buildings used for legal purposes, not religious ones. So, as a review, why are churches based on basilicae? So, adopting that design positioned God as the arbiter and a figure of authority, a giver of justice, while it also distanced churches from pagan temples. And it was visually significant, having these big long halls lead to the altar. We can see here the central halls of a basilica with the nave, side aisles, and the clerestory above. The clerestory being the extension here that raises the portions of the roof up here. Now, why is raising the roof here important? Besides just making the building a bit taller, it lets in a bit more light through these windows. Without electricity, it's hard to light such large spaces without sunlight. If you've ever lit candles when the power goes out, think about how much less light you got from them than your average light bulb. But it's also religiously significant. What kind of house of worship is a dark church for a god that famously said, "Fiat lux," or "Let there be light"? Here's the floor plan of that same church, Old St. Peter's. It's called a basilica because it conforms to this design. You can see an atrium at the entrance, the nave flanked with columns, side aisles, the transept, so called because it goes across the nave, trans being the Latin prefix for across, and the apse. The semicircular extension in which the altar sits is the apse, this thing right here. The apse at the end of the church, with the nave leading up, puts the altar in a visually powerful position. The transept also has the added bonus of making the church cross-shaped, a design feature later churches emphasize. As Christian churches spread and their construction becomes increasingly stylized, it becomes an architecture form labeled Romanesque. This is helped by the fact that churches are also growing wealthier. With now the vast majority of the population of Western Europe Christian and the church gaining land and authority, there was more wealth devoted to church building. When a church was built, they often chose to work in stone. Churches built when Christianity first arrived are expanded and converted into stone churches. Stone churches, when properly maintained, can last for many centuries. Stone churches can be larger and more impressive, and their increased cost makes them both harder to build and also more impressive when it is done. For both bishops and lords, contributing to such a monument to their faith is a good way to secure one's memory. As the architectural style developed, the apse expanded, as you can see here. Note how the expanded apse also furthers the effect of the transept becoming a cross. And once again, as a reminder, the transept is this bit that cuts across, so you can see a very visibly cross-shaped image in the architecture. This is the floor plan of the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, one of the big pilgrimage destinations. I use the term cathedral here. A cathedral is simply a church where a bishop has his seat. So all cathedrals are churches, but not all churches are cathedrals. And speaking of pilgrims, you can see a few little things coming here off the side. These are side chapels, small worship spaces partially separated from the main church. These were often funded by major donors to the church and were richly decorated. Think of it kind of like how people donate to buildings to get their name on them. And it wasn't just individuals. Some guilds funded chapels, giving them a sort of worship space all their own and using the resources of their organization to fund something they couldn't afford on their own. They also provided places for relics, where they could be accessed off the side aisle without interfering with the main activities of the altar and the nave. So, let's spend a little bit of time talking about relics. Relics are the physical remnants of saints, that is bones, but also blood, especially the blood of Christ, or hair, or clothing, or anything like that. They can also be objects touched or owned by saints. The Shroud of Turin would be one such example. More comically, if you've seen Life of Brian, Brian's gourd and sandal are being treated as relics. Much like today, we might go to the Smithsonian Museum to see important objects from U.S. and world history, or maybe go to the Berlin Botanical Gardens to see Alexander von Humboldt's walking stick, or maybe that might just be for us who are interested in that. But relics serve as important ways to physically substantiate our connection to history and religion. Note that relics were not worshipped, but venerated. They were objects that encouraged worship and divine connection, but were not objects of worship as such. As we brought up in previous lectures, relics drew pilgrims from across Europe. They would come to be in their presence, getting as close as possible, and even touching the reliquaries, highly decorated containers for relics. Having more and more popular relics could bring wealth to cathedrals, and just as important was that the churches presented themselves in the relics in as impressive a way as possible. This made relics and their presentation competitive, trying to draw pilgrims to your site as opposed to others. Having relics was also a source of authority. We mentioned how oaths were made over relics, but even possessing relics was a way to justify your piety and authority, at least in regard to the saint whose relics you hold. Such competition could be somewhat crazy. One of the Benedictine monasteries in Francia successfully stole Saint Benedict's remains from the Italian monastery in which they lay. The situation was made all the more absurd by papal approval of their holding the relics. And after all, if St. Benedict hadn't wanted to leave, he presumably could have intervened in the stealing of the relics. And the approval some generations later of the original monasteries claims that the relics never left at all. 2 monasteries actively claimed, with papal approval, to have the same set of bones. Relics could also venture into the bizarre. Several medieval churches claimed to have Christ's foreskin. Anyway, let's turn back to architecture. Here you can see the chapel, or rather the Church of St. Vincenz of Cardona, built during the period of 1019 to 1040. It's quite imposing, tower above anything else in the community, and it certainly would have imparted a sense of the authority of God. But you might also notice these small windows. They just aren't that large and would limit the amount of incoming light. You can see here at the Jumièges Abbey in Normandy and the Church of Santa Maria in Cosmedin, Rome. Again, towering, imposing, but neither light nor elegant. So, what's the limitation? Builders are still using Roman building techniques, especially vaulting. The rounded vaults of Roman design allowed for a lot more area between columns compared to just flat stone roofs, but the arches push a lot of weight to the sides. Walls had to be thick, with large buttresses or wall extrusions to hold them in place. The sheer weight of the material used imposed severe height limitations, but windows were small and couldn't really let in the light. This makes religious spaces meant to feel uplifting instead somewhat claustrophobic, we'll say. In the 12th century, a new technology is developed, however. Rather than rounded arches, new pointed arches start being built. Pointed arches direct more force down as opposed to out. When built with them, windows become taller and require thinner walls to support. Vaults made of these pointed arches are called rib vaulting. You can see its intersecting patterns here, which also concentrates force in a way that makes it easier to channel it into specific directions. Buildings can be made taller and with more light let in. It's hard to understate the impact of this change upon the feel of the space. The next element that helps changes cathedral building is what is called a flying buttress. They are heavily support pillars, but unlike normal buttresses, which are just extrusions to the wall, the flying buttresses are pulled away, supporting the upper stories with arches instead of large walls. By pulling the buttress away from the walls themselves can be thinner, while still supporting even greater weights, and once again, providing more light. Moving on to the more decorative elements of the church, stained glass used expands, taking advantage of larger window spaces. In particular, we see the development of rose windows, which you can see here. with stone tracery supporting them, they create a stunning centerpiece to the architectural decorations of many cathedrals. And once again, we see the crucial goal of architectural features being the use and manipulation of light. Now let's take a look at one specific building. The Chartres Cathedral has a large rose window which Viard de Honnecourt depicted in the early 13th century. Take a look at either image, the window itself or the drawing, and we see how each window section is the same length, a way of creating some symmetry in the design. So the first question, how many of the various elements are there? When I say how many of the various elements, I mean especially looking at all these individual little circles and flourishes, and even the little dots that you see amongst the trefoils. Well, we can count 12 of all these sets of objects. The number of the apostles. Remember that the majority of people weren't literate. Religious messages and symbols could be built into churches to communicate to those unable to engage with the written word. In fact, some Coptic churches in Egypt will have 12 pillars with 11 white and 1 black to mark Judas. And if this whole idea of the 12 images or the 12 creating symmetry did not stand out to you, it's important to note that we in society today are a highly literate culture, and thus we are more used to information being delivered to us through written text spelling things out. To a medieval person, it was a lot less of a far-fetched idea to be able to look at something and see how it comports a certain degree of significance with a certain idea. So to a medieval mindset, seeing this, they very well may have noticed the image of 12s or the repeating number of 12s throughout, and this would have made a closer connection to them of the idea of 12 as a significant number. For us, it's not nearly as obvious. So, in any case, between these two images, we want to ask, what does Honnecourt change and why? Well, for one, these 4 pointed elements that you can see right here are reduced to 3 pointed little clover-like designs. 3 is an important number in Christianity, especially for the concept of the Trinity, and that is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, what makes up the Godhead. He also adds in another 4-point clover right here. This provides a better representation of symbolic aspects of windows, even if such a design was impractical to build in real life. Because, quite frankly, a window like this, even today, would be virtually impossible to build and have it be supportable in an actual normal context, such as a cathedral. In addition to these large-scale architectural elements, we can also see increased investment in architectural sculpture and statuary. Images include Christ, the apostles, and saints, but also include kings, often those who contributed to the construction, and bishops, either from the church's history or contemporary contributors, and on a less pleasant note, the occasional devil. Here you can see a couple of examples. One tympanum, that is the block filling the arch above the door, from the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, and drawings of now destroyed column statues from the west facade of the same building. As an extension of this, we also see the development of gargoyles. Leering figures, often animal or demonic, as you can see, they served to channel water off the roof to prevent erosion. Water flowed down the lead channels from the roof and was routed to the gargoyles to spit out. Think a gutter, but with a face. Every part of the building was fair game for ornamentation. Now, most of these elements existed on their own by the 12th century, but the creation of a style that brought them all together occurred in northern France, in the area around Paris. Once more, we need to remember that they weren't necessarily thinking, here is a new style we are starting. The term was coined in the 16th century by Giorgio Vasari, an Italian artist and historian who did not think that art was that impressive from the time period. And frankly, he's wrong, but he also thought it was invented by the Goths who sacked Rome, which was also wrong. So what's our context? So in northern France, the Capetian dynasty has taken over and is busy consolidated the French kingdom. Cities are expanding, meaning a greater concentration of wealth for those building projects and a great deal of specialization. To the right are a modern artist's renditions of some of the many specialist jobs required to build a cathedral. From carpenters to masons to blacksmiths, a cathedral required many people with many skills hired, sometimes for decades at a time. As the church gains greater independence from secular rulers, bishops have grown in power and wealth, and cathedrals are one way to display said authority. So why build a cathedral? Well, we've discussed the demonstration of wealth a bit today. There's also piety and penance, such as William the Conqueror's construction of churches after his violent conquest and suppression of rebels. Churches are also the centerpiece of a community, and so an impressive cathedral is also part of binding together a community. Finally, we mentioned pilgrimage. The more pilgrims come, the more economic activity is moving through the town. Similar to the Romanesque churches, here's a plan of a Gothic cathedral, the main subject for today. The general cross-shaped design is still present, but you can see how the space behind the choir, where the altar would be and the monks would hold service, is expanded so the chapels can be accessed without interference. So let's talk about actually building a Gothic cathedral. These projects were extensive and expensive. Rather than single constructions, almost all cathedrals are built piecemeal. Old Romanesque churches are expanded with Gothic components, as they are section by section replaced with new ones. The process can take decades, and many cathedrals continue to be improved and expanded over centuries. The work is difficult, with heavy building materials having to be lifted under human power to the high elevation on rickety wooden scaffolds. Here you can see the Great Wheel. Basically a massive hamster wheel people would walk to fit stone blocks to the upper, or rather lift stone blocks to the upper stories. But cathedrals would tower literally over their communities, serving as center points of worship and community life. Let's take a look at one example of this community engagement with construction from the letter of Hugh, Archbishop of Rouen, to Bishop Thierry, Bishop of Amiens. We see Hugh describing the lay people doing something interesting. What is that? The people are helping to build the cathedral, using their carts to transport materials to the site and speed the cathedral's construction. Why? Well, as you may be able to figure, like pilgrimage or the Crusades, helping to build a cathedral was an expression of religious devotion. It demonstrated to God their piety and their willingness to sacrifice for the faith. Of course, there are the less idealistic reasons to contribute. The financial power and prestige of a cathedral was also something people would have wanted. This was a practice known as the cult of the carts, a practice in Normandy and one of the centers of Gothic cathedral building. So we're going to start talking about perhaps the single most important figure for the primary development of Gothic architecture, and that's a gentleman by the name of Suger. So Suger lived from around 1081 to 1151 and was abbot of Saint-Denis, a monastery near Paris. Today, Paris has expanded to such an extent that Saint-Denis lies within the city, but previously this monastery would have been located a bit of a ways outside of the city walls. Saint-Denis housed the relics of Saint Denis, the patron saint of France. Suger served as an advisor to French monarchs, in part because of his proximity to the court, in part because Saint-Denis was where French monarchs were traditionally buried. While abbot, he rebuilt the church, rather the old church, transforming it into the first true Gothic church. However, because it was an extremely expensive effort, he first needed to consolidate church properties to improve revenue. It is with this, not the church project, that Abbott begins his memoirs. But after some years, he felt ready to begin. Here's the plan to update the old church. You can see the footprint of the old Carolingian church right here, of which much was replaced by Suger's projects. Running from about 1135 to 1140, Abbot Suger began his reconstruction of the monastery, or rather of the church. The first phase was the expansion of the nave and the construction of a new facade, featuring a set of paired towers, 3 portals, the main entrances, with carved tympanums, or tympana, depending on who you ask. In vertical buttresses, a rose window in a square frame. Originally built with a large north tower, symmetry was put aside for the chance to get at least one high tower in, it was dismantled in 1146. So, Phase 2, starting in around 1140, was the enlargement of the choir. That's the rounded section past the transept, which looks, or rather includes, the apse. Let's take a look at Abbot Suger's own account of his work. What does Suger say was the reason the choir needed to be rebuilt? He has this comment about how the new choir would be, quote, where the continual and frequent victim of our redemption should be sacrificed in secret without disturbance by the crowds. His monks celebrated Mass daily, but the church had become a site for pilgrims to visit. Something new needed to be done to accommodate the crowds and allow Mass to be celebrated in private. Think about life at a monastery. An emphasis on quiet contemplation does not mesh well with the constant flow of pilgrims interrupting, almost like modern tourists at today's holy sites. So how long did it take to rebuild the choir? Is it seen as a short or a long amount of time? Well, Suger says it took 3 years and 3 months, and gives praise for the speed of its construction. This gives us a real idea how long these projects took. Abbot Suger, from a wealthy abbey and connected to France's elite, still took several years to complete only one portion of the project. And you know what? He's even kind of fudging the numbers a bit. It actually took closer to 3 years and 9 months. A question for you all. Symbolically, why stick to 3 months? And furthermore, so once the choir was finished, what came next? And well, to answer the question about why stick to 3 months, well, once again, as we've seen kind of repeated, is there's a whole lot of religious symbolism and imagery going into all of this. So, you can take it pretty much exactly as 3 equals the Trinity. So, and then next came the transept wings and the nave. This excerpt includes the start of that project, and Suger would not live to see the churches fully rebuilt. Abbot Odo Clement was the one who started on the nave almost a century later in 1231. To wrap up, what can we say about Suger himself? Well, I mean, long story short, he's clearly proud to have constructed so noble and pleasing of an edifice, as he says in his own words, but also emphasizes the communal nature of the work. What do you think? Is this another instance of the humility topos that we will see reappearing, or is this actually pride? So here's the plan of the choir in an image of what it looks like today. You can see the ambulatory, the area behind the choir for people to come and view the chapels. That would be this. You can also see the flying buttresses supporting thin walls to let light in. Here's what the church might have looked like after the choir's completion. You can see how the piecemeal project makes it a bit imbalanced, but it took money and time to do each stage, so they had to prioritize their needs and their resources. Note the nave, the space for the common people to take part in Mass, was done after the front facade in the choir. A space to make the church visibly arresting, or rather, visually arresting, and one to accommodate the primary audience, the monks. As architecture spread in popularity, its elements found its way into art. In one such example, you would often find this in Psalters. A Psalter is a book used in Christian private devotional practice, and the text consists of the 150 Psalms of the Hebrew Bible, meant to be recited over the course of the week. This one was made for the king, or rather for King Louis IX of France after his 1254 return from crusade. And you can see to the right that the Binding of Isaac has made a return. As they became more used to working with these new architectural elements, churches got larger and larger. This is also part of the process of one-upmanship, with communities and bishops trying to outdo one another. Köln Cathedral can be seen here at the end of this. At this point, they're hitting the upper limits of what they can build before it exceeds what they're capable of. That didn't necessarily keep them from trying. Part of the choir of the Beauvais Cathedral collapsed under construction in 1284, probably as a result of high winds, but it illustrated the limits of the construction techniques. In the end, cathedrals formed centerpieces to cities across Europe, built from stone or sometimes of brick, as you can see here from a Danish cathedral. They towered above their communities in many places, such as Notre Dame in Paris, or rather Paris, sorry, force of habit, and they still lie at the center of cities and still draw the eye upwards. To return to a show about medieval cathedral building called Pillars of the Earth, want to end by sharing their comments on cathedral after construction is concluded. And here's a quote from Pillars of the Earth. But the cathedral is not finished, nor will it ever be. Just as human perfection is something we all strive for and can never attain, so this church will forever be changing, growing, crumbling at times, an ongoing legacy of our feeble efforts to touch God. A cathedral, my friends, is neither stone nor statue, nor even a place of prayer. It is a continuum of creation. Beautiful work that, pray God, will never end. Given the fire at Notre Dame a few months ago, perhaps this is some consolation.